Don't be discouraged by the title, because business always sounds very dry, and we're at a software conference and nobody wants to talk about business. But I'll try to make it as little dry as possible and go to the juicy parts. So generally, before diving into the hard parts, like what is open source, there are lots of definitions out there. People are never sure what it is. We'll stick to the very simple definition: allow software to be freely used, modified, and shared. That's from opensource.org, which are kind of the maintainers of the spirit. And they even have like an official definition of all the points an open source software license should have, which I think they say that originally has come from the Debian Foundation, which started that in '97. So the idea of open source and how it is defined is kind of old, and we're still working around that. So just quick show of hands, who is using open source software? Which is probably pretty much everybody. Who is opening issues on open source software? That's fewer. Who is contributing back? Is anybody maintaining a project? That's okay, even fewer hands. That's kind of the common thing you see. Oftentimes when you ask like, who wants well-maintained open source software, then everybody raises their hand and then says like, and who wants to actually contribute fixes, and then all the hands go down. And then do you ask like, who wants to maintain that, and then everybody is gone. And that's oftentimes what you kind of see. So this is kind of like a bit of a political statement then. Some people have this opinion that people need to be paid to do open source software, or a lot of people are paid to do open source software actually. So for example, this is from the Puppet founder, who said like 98.5% of the code in Puppet, which is open source, was done by paid people, or people he actually paid to do that. So while the open source spirit is great and there and works for some projects really well, for a lot of projects it actually means paying somebody to create the open source code. So the one thing that you always need to keep in mind is that open source is not a business model. I think open source is kind of like better in every term than closed source software, except for making money, which otherwise, like distribution, everything is much easier, but making money is much harder. It's kind of a more complicated problem. And we internally, our own CEO says it's kind of a distribution model that allows you to build a community and then use that as a force multiplier. And that's really out there to spread the software. So if you want to get your software widely used, open source is kind of a great way to do that. Because does anybody know that logo? It's Datomic. Anybody heard of Datomic? It's the database close to Clojure, which the append-only approach, which kind of fit in very well with the Clojure ecosystem. The problem was they never had an open source version. And then it was always confined to a very niche space, both because of Clojure, but also because they didn't have the open source version to actually spread it out. They're still around. They're keep doing what they have been doing, but they're confined to a very small segment because they didn't have this open source force multiplier, so they were kind of stuck in that little space they had. So why am I even talking about that? So I work for Elastic, the company behind various open source products. My official role is developer advocate, so I mostly get to travel and talk about stuff I find interesting. And you get to listen to that, or have to listen to that. We have various open source products. Is anybody using any of our products? Okay, good. You used to? Not anymore. Okay, we'll have to talk about that afterwards.
I changed company. My company was actually founded on Elasticsearch because it was search engine.
Very good. We like to hear that. We like to hear that people are heavily using our stuff. Very good. So yeah, even if you're not using it directly, even if you're coding anywhere, you're indirectly using it a lot, because if you're searching on any of these sites, the search is going through Elasticsearch, for example. And similarly for logging use cases and various other use cases. And we as a company are kind of large now. I think we're 1,100 people or so, but it changes every week, so it's very hard to keep track because we're growing so quickly. And then the obvious question is, how do you pay the salary for 1,100 people? Basically, where is the money? It's kind of the common question. And I want to split this talk in kind of like 3 areas, where the first 2 are larger and the last one is a bit smaller. So first off, strategy is like, how can you even make money with open source software? Because it's basically free. There is no money. Secondly, kind of struggle. What are common pain points that you run into? And finally, success. What does it even mean to be successful, or what could be success? Okay, so strategy. How do you make money with open source software? There are three main things that people do to do that. The first thing is around services: support, consulting, training, certification. Two companies that probably everybody knows is first Canonical. What is Canonical doing? No, what is the main product of Canonical? Ubuntu. They're the company behind Ubuntu, and then they're providing certification and support and everything around that. The other company that everybody knows is Red Hat. And if you look at the revenue numbers from Red Hat, they have been growing steadily for a long, long time. So the assumption is that what everybody could say now is, well, we'll just copy the Red Hat model, and that's easy. We'll just do what Red Hat has been doing so successfully for a long time, and we'll be just as successful as Red Hat. Right? Or not? Unfortunately, it's not really that easy. So the first problem is, if you have a product that is easy to use and kind of intuitive, why would I want to buy support from you? And you have kind of this dilemma of like, if my software is too easy to use, I will starve as a company. So what if I make it harder to use? Or my documentation worse, because then people need to ask us for support, which is not a good situation to be in. It's like your company basically depends on having crappy software and crappy documentation. I'm not saying that Red Hat is doing that. It's just like, it's generally a problem field in which you're in. Like, if you're too easy to use and too intuitive, why would I pay you for support? Second thing is, oftentimes renewal rates are very bad. Because, well, you don't know the software, you pay for support 1, 2, 3 years, then you look at how many big issues did we have. Not that many. Well, why are we keep paying for support? Like, we can do that ourselves now. We know the software now, we know it's working well, we know the problems. Why are we even paying them anymore? So renewal rates are normally very bad if you have just support. Then the final thing is, if you have, for example, consulting, what happens with your consulting only competition? Because other companies can just say, like, oh, for your product, we'll just offer consulting. And our rates will be half as expensive because we'll just only do consulting, whereas you have to do both the product development and the consulting. So you can only have like half of the billable hours, basically. So your rates will need to be much higher. Yes, you might know it a bit better, but a lot of companies, maybe not in Switzerland, but in other places, I don't know. But a lot of companies are mainly interested in prices. So if you don't have the right price, it might be complicated to compete there. So that might be a problem. Support works for some, but not for everybody. The other, or the next thing that a lot of companies do is open core, which is basically you have some open source thing, but to use it as an enterprise in production, you need kind of the commercial extensions, which is common. So for example, MySQL had that for a long time, and now that they're owned by Oracle, they have that more and more, that you get lots of features that are kind of like for higher availability or more security, integration into your LDAP or whatever, that is commercial. Because, well, as an open source user, you don't really need those things that much. But if you're an enterprise, you need that and you're willing to pay for that. So you can do that. Same for MapR. It's one of the 3 big Hadoop vendors. They have like these 3 levels, which I always find super confusing. They have M3, which is open source. And if you want to have high availability, then there is M5. And if you want to have more performance, because they've rewritten lots of stuff, then there is M7. And only M3 is open source and free to use. If you want to use more, then you need to pay them. And then you think, well, that might also be easy. But unfortunately, it's not always that easy. Because basically, somebody else might try to eat your lunch, which might look something like this. Or others are basically freeloading on what you are doing. And the freeloading could look something like this. So if you have a couple of commercial tools, like you're doing all the open source software, and then you have like 20% or so of tools on top of that are commercial. Somebody could just compete with you on the commercial tools. They don't have to do all the open source development. They will just compete on the commercial stuff. And that's kind of like a big advantage for them. So they will probably always undercut you in price because they don't have to carry the general open source development. The other thing is you have, again, this force field, like you need to make more money as a company. And then kind of naturally, you're starting to do less and less open source work and more on the commercial side. And it's a very hard discussion internally because development would often say like, oh, let's make everything open source because we have these great tools and we want everybody to use them. And then you have sales who are being paid on what they sell, and they will say, well, we shouldn't have any open source anymore. I've often heard that sales is saying that open source is their biggest competitor. It's not their actual competition, but the open source version is kind of what they're competing with, which is kind of a good and a bad statement in itself, but this is a problem that you will face as a company. And then you have often the cloud providers. So for example, if you make security or high availability commercial, cloud providers often provide a service and they take these parts and provide them as a service for you. So they will take care of the high availability and they will stick some security solution in front of the open source part, and then they basically also cut you off from your revenue stream. So that was the second way how to make money. And the third one would be, you have your open source version, but for people who don't want to run your service yourself, you just provide it as a service, which works for some very well. For example, if you want to get WordPress, I'm not trying to advertise WordPress, don't use WordPress, but if you do use WordPress, you can, if you go to wordpress.org, you get the downloadable version and you can run it yourself. If you go to wordpress.com, you get, from the company who is doing most of the development work, you get the same thing as service and you can just use that. Another example would be Sentry, which is like stack trace or error aggregation, and they can show you how many exceptions have been happening in the last 24 hours, how many users were affected, how many times did they happen. Everything is BSD licensed, they have, but you can, if you say like, oh, it's such a small service, I don't want to run that myself, I will just pay somebody like $50 a month or whatever, that they run the service for me. And that seems to be working very well for them. The problem again is somebody might come and tries to eat your lunch, which might look something like this. So who is the little monkey who is trying to eat your lunch? It's mostly the big cloud providers. So if you have a very popular service, there's a very good chance, if it's under an open source license, that they will just take your service and provide it as a service on their platform. Which raises questions, and there is this very nice statement that kind of the idea of open source was not that some big cloud corporation can take it and offers it a service and take your money. That was kind of not the idea of that's what is happening very widely. So for example, if you go to AWS and you want to get MySQL, Postgres, Redis, Elasticsearch, various other services, you will get them, but the people doing the actual software are not getting anything from that. It's just AWS taking the profit from that. Which, well, you can debate if that is ethically correct or not. In the legal sense, under an open source license, it's totally fine, but maybe it's not helping the software in the long run. So these were the three main things how to make money, and then there are some more obscure ones I also want to share. The first one is like, you could have a partnership to make money out of your software. Anybody has an idea what partnerships are out there? No, that's another point. I will get to like bounties and stuff like that as well. This is more like one corporation has a partnership with another corporation. And the main example that I have here is Firefox. Because if you're in the US, the default search engine in Firefox is Yahoo. And they paid, I think over 5 years, more than $300 million to be the default search engine in the US. Because they thought, well, that will drive traffic to Yahoo. I think in reality, most people just switch to Google. But they paid a lot of money to be the default search engine. Which, well, works, but it's kind of expensive. The thing that some people do is they say like donations work for open stuff. Anybody knows what's probably the biggest project living off donations? Yes, exactly, Wikipedia. So the Wikimedia Foundation, they have the reports online, and I think 2016, 2017, they made like $90 million in donations. But they have kind of like this special place because, well, a lot of people come to their website. It's one of the, I don't know, top whatever website in the world. So they have a lot of traffic and a lot of people value that and pay for that. The problem is every time somebody points to that, somebody else will say like, yes, there are also 10 other examples where this failed. So it's basically just, you can be lucky with donations and it works for some companies. But there are also a lot of other places where this failed, basically. So donations sound very appealing because you don't have to compromise on your open source values. You just keep doing what you do, and then you hope that people value that and give you money for that. In reality, it might be hard to get enough money out of that, especially if you're a larger company, like paying 100 salaries on donations is also very hard to plan. What if people don't keep donating that much anymore? What do you do with all the people? Next thing that people sometimes do is certified partners. So basically, you have on the website of the product, you have a list of certified partners. So if you do want or need any customization, these are the preferred partners. Go to them. We trust them. Basically, they pay a fee to be listed. Moodle, the e-learning platform, is one of the examples where this is happening. So they have the certified partners, and they need to funnel back some money into the Moodle project for being listed. Again, maybe not a huge amount of money, but it's another approach. You basically depend on having a very strong commercial ecosystem around it. Otherwise, if it's mostly open source stuff, you're not going to earn a lot of money. Next up, you could use ads. Anybody knows who is making money with ads and it's kind of like a bit counterintuitive? Is Adblock, yes. Adblock is making money out of that. Do you know how that works?
You can pay to be in whitelist.
Yes, so Adblock has this concept of, they say like, you're acceptable ads, and if you're small, you can just be whitelisted. But if you're large, you have to pay for that. So for example, I think Google is paying a good sum that their ads on google.com are added to that site. And that is how they make money. So for the small sites, it's kind of free, but for large sites, acceptable ads can be bought. They always say it will only be acceptable ads. The problem is, what is acceptable? Especially if it's a very large sum somebody's offering, maybe your boundaries for acceptable might be shifting. It's kind of like also a pressure field where you might not want to be. What other projects are doing is merchandise. So you can basically buy swag. So you have a store and then you can buy branded products. For example, OpenBSD is doing that. You can buy mugs and shirts and all kinds of things with the OpenBSD logo. And part of the revenue is going to the foundation to do OpenBSD. However, I think this will only get you a very small amount of money, because how many mugs with the OpenBSD logo can you sell? It's mainly more for hardware and servers that you get those, but probably not to pay salaries. Yeah, how much money is really in swag? And then, that was the point you had before, is Bounties crowdfunding. You could just say like, oh, I want this feature, or I want to have this product built. There was a game a few years ago that was on Kickstarter. I think it's one of the few projects on Kickstarter that actually worked, because Kickstarter is oftentimes like, we promise something, everybody pays, and then nothing happens. But that game was actually built. I think they collected like $10,000 or so. It was Cataclysm. I think it was 2013 when that game was built. So that worked. The problem with paid features is generally what happens to your vision or the maintainability of your product. Because if somebody comes around and says like, oh, we offer you this amount of money to implement this feature, and you know that this is probably not a good feature to have, you might still take the money and put it in there. But then you have, for a long time, the burden of maintaining that feature, and that might be very costly. And it might push your product into kind of like directions where you don't want it to go. And you don't want to have specific features because just the cost of maintenance is very high. So you kind of might drift into an area where you don't really want to be. For example, I think we had one feature where Microsoft paid a lot of money a long time ago, at least back then it was a lot of money, to have a specific feature. But it just really didn't work with what we tried to do, and we got rid of it later on and they didn't require it anymore. But that, for us, or in Elasticsearch, also showed that sometimes somebody wants something very badly, but for the overall product, it's not the right thing to do. But if you have this monetary incentive, then you might do stuff that you shouldn't do. So that's kind of another force field. Okay, struggle. So now that we kind of looked at what could you do to make money, what is the struggle? So the first one is the philosophy. I really like this quote. You're only really contributing to open source if you're contributing upstream. Otherwise, you're just consuming open source and using it for what you're doing. So if your tool is built on some library or framework or something else, you should contribute back to that as well. Otherwise, you're not doing properly open source. So for example, for Elasticsearch, we're built on Apache Lucene. And I don't have the exact numbers, but probably half of the commits or work in Lucene is coming from us nowadays. Because, well, that's upstream and that's where we try to contribute. We have Amazon is providing Elasticsearch as a service as well, which is a competing product to us, which we don't like that much. And they will have blog posts like this, which we are not very happy about that one. So the first thing that we find very annoying is that they call Elasticsearch Amazon Elasticsearch Service, and they call it AES, which is something else in our opinion. AES is kind of like a taken abbreviation. And the other thing is, they recently had this incident where they added an analyzer for Korean. So they wanted to add support for Korean. But since they need to run this on the cloud, they have very memory constrained instances. And the Korean language seems to be very complicated, so it needs a lot of heap. And they didn't want that. So what they did is they basically had opened a pull request against the Korean analyzer from the community to decrease the heap size. However, it turned out they also slowed down the entire thing 15 to 20 times. Not percent, but times. So it was barely usable anymore. But they could provide it in their cloud and had another feature they added. They then made some tweaking. It needs a bit more memory now, but it's still like way slower. That is not the right way to contribute stuff and make stuff happen. That is only like if you need a quick fix. We saw the kind of the same problem. What we did is we added another implementation in Lucene. And that's kind of a better implementation. It uses less heap, but it's still faster than the other implementation. But it is much more work. Whereas the Amazon approach is very much, they look like what is out in the open source space? What can we take and make work somehow on our stuff? We have kind of like a philosophical problem with that. Another problem might be you have three kinds of groups that you interact with. You have contributors, those who will give you issues or even code or in pull requests back. You have users, which are also great, and then sometimes you have consumers who will basically just take but not give back. You might also call them the vultures, and they just sit in the tree and try to devour your open source product. Yeah, Amazon is one of the kind of worst players in that space. For example, there is their Athena service, which is basically Presto, which Facebook built, and they basically customized it a bit and now run it as a commercial service. They are very good at doing stuff like that. Also, Microsoft is sometimes doing that, and Redis, for example, is very unhappy that they have something called Azure Redis Cache. So it's not Redis anymore, but it's Azure Redis Cache, and they basically take the open source stuff and just run it as a service on their platform. And the people sponsoring the majority of the Redis commits, they have a cloud service as well. So obviously, they won't be very good friends with Azure around this. Speaking of Redis, there was a lot of drama recently around that. Did anybody see the drama around Redis? It was like 2 months ago. So Redis, the core product is BSD licensed, and it will stay that way. But they have these modules around it. So they have something around search, a graph, they can store JSON, they have a Bloom filter, they have some machine learning things there like plugins to Redis. And they were AGPL licensed so far. So they try to protect against cloud providers not using them because, well, AGPL is kind of, you make any changes, you need to open them. But they have changed license, and it's now the Apache 2 license, but modified with the commons clause, and that was 2 months ago. And that is kind of tricky. But the commons clause is basically saying that you cannot sell the software in any way. So if you're a cloud provider, you cannot do that. Even if you are a service provider, you cannot sell Redis as part of that package, and you would need like a special clause or a special license with them. So this is the commons clause, which is commonsclause.com. Question is like, is this still open source? No, it's not open source anymore. You can see the source code, but you have these limitations. So you cannot say you cannot sell that software anymore. That would be a limitation that is not allowed under the open source rules. Like at the very beginning where I mentioned opensource.org, it's one of the conditions that generally applies to open source software, that you cannot make these conditions that cloud services, you have a very hard time forbidding somebody from selling, even if open sourcing under the same license. AGPL generally just forces you to open source any modifications that you made, but that's everything. Like you could just run it as a service and nobody could stop you, so that's doable. The second main problem about the commons clause is that it is adding a lot of confusion from 2 areas. First, they started abbreviating it with CC, which with Creative Commons is really not a great abbreviation. And the other thing is it's called Apache 2 modified with commons clause. And like you have a very particular expectation when you see Apache 2. And you cannot just say like, oh, this is Apache 2 minus those other rules that I've just added. That's very tricky because Apache 2, like nobody reads the modified with commons clause yet. You basically forget that. So it is very easy to forget that. That's kind of a problem around that area. And then on Twitter, like various people voiced their opinions or wrote articles. The problem was this was one of the investors of Redis Labs, the company behind it. And when you say the rabbit open source wonks and you're an investor, you're probably not making a lot of friends in the open source ecosystem. So that's kind of like, obviously, the investors behind the product will have a very particular view. On the other hand, you see a lot of negative criticism or feedback, and you should not forget that maybe some of that feedback is also coming from the big corporations making good money off Redis. So obviously, Amazon, Azure, and others will not say very nice things about such a license change, because suddenly they cannot just use the work of others for free anymore. So it's always these two camps, and you kind of need to find the middle ground and see is kind of like who is pushing what message. But that was kind of like badly reported in a lot of news outlets, unfortunately, is Redis itself is staying on the BSD license. They're not changing that. It's just these additional modules on top. Unfortunately, they did the communication also a bit bad, and Salvatore, the guy who wrote that, he had to write 2 blog posts about that Redis is not changing to open core and not changing the license. It's just these additional plugins on top. So communication wasn't that great in that area, but the general intention is Redis is not going away or changing anything in this license. Next up, MongoDB. MongoDB just had last week, I think, had another license issue. Did anybody see that? Yes, 1, 2. So what they did is, so for a long time, the server component was AGPL licensed. The clients were always Apache licensed, so you didn't have any issues using their clients. But I think 2 weeks ago, they added they suddenly changed from one day to the next to the server-side public license. This is a new license they created or made up. It is very similar, I think, to the AGPL. With one change, they have this specific clause about offering the program as a service, which they basically disallow. It's kind of the same idea. They also want to get rid of Amazon or anybody else. Amazon is not even offering MongoDB as a service because it's AGPL, and they didn't really want to touch that probably. But they want to make sure that nobody can use their work as a service. Only they themselves can that. Is that license open source? As of today, no. But they're trying to get it approved by the OSI to be an open source license. The outcome of that is a bit unsure. My personal opinion is that it should not be a proper open source license, but we'll see what will be decided. But as of today, MongoDB is not open source anymore. Also, their community edition is not under an approved open source license. Why did they not? I don't know, we're not okay with the AGPL that they had before, because they still had the fear that somebody might still offer it as a service. And there were some other companies offering MongoDB as a service. Question, sorry? No, okay. And there are some people who say that this has actually merit, and this should basically close a loophole that the Free Software Foundation kind of failed to close a long time ago. So a long time ago, there were ASP, the application service providers, which was kind of like the idea before cloud, to offer services as a service. And it's kind of like the open source licenses we have today were very well geared towards binaries and how to make sure that binaries are fairly shared. But they are very bad for making sure that not somebody else is reaping your profits basically from offering them as a cloud service. And some people say that maybe this is a loophole that should be closed, and that maybe we need an additional set of licenses which we don't call open source, but where we say, okay, this is still an open license, which whatever you call that, because you can use it on premise for free and without limitations. You still need to open source the changes that you make, but you cannot use something or provide something as a service. So this might be something that might have merit. One thing that was very unfortunate here was timing, because basically they announced that we're changing the license today. Like any change going forward from today onwards is under this new license. And especially if you're a larger company, this is a big problem, because if it's not an approved open source license, probably your legal department will need to check that. And your legal department might take a few months to check. But until then, you cannot even get the next patch level update with some important bug fix maybe, because the license is not approved and changed. So I guess the cleaner approach would have been to A, give people a bit more time to say like, okay, this is the new license and now you have time to check it. And B, we just do that with a minor or even major release. And we don't do that in the next patch level release, because basically you're cutting off people from that patch level release. And I think they announced that the change 2 weeks ago, and yesterday they released a minor patch level release. And probably a lot of companies are not installing that or are able to use that now because of this. And they also have another problem. Anybody knows that logo? Nobody from the Microsoft ecosystem here? Cosmos DB. So it's the multi-model database that Microsoft is pushing a lot of energy in and trying to make really big. And what they have done is they have compatible APIs to MongoDB. So it looks like you're talking to MongoDB, but you're actually talking to Cosmos DB. It's only like 95 or 99 or whatever % compatible, so you might run into issues. But they generally, since they didn't want to touch the AGPL code, they just said like, okay, MongoDB is hugely popular. We should be able to use that. But since we don't want to touch the AGPL, we'll just re-implement it and have the APIs on the outside, which in my opinion is even worse because basically MongoDB is out of the equation now. They just evolve on their own now, and they don't have any influence in there anymore. So that is kind of a problem. Besides the vultures, there's also this other thing called open source users, which sometimes are not the best to have. So we recently had this nice discussion on our Discuss forum where somebody was complaining a lot that, I don't know, so many open issues or pull requests or whatever. How can you rely on a product with such bad support? What is the obvious question that you would ask afterwards? Yes, we did. And we asked, would you be willing to take some load? And of course not. Why can't you hire one more developer? Which is kind of the entitlement in the open source ecosystem is sometimes a bit stunning. And well, the author of Homebrew, Mike McQuaid, he has this very nice statement where he says like, you're entitled to your refund of $0 you paid for the software. Otherwise, you can get involved to make it better. That is kind of the only proper way to do that. Don't write angry complaints about open source software if you're not helping in any way, because you're basically just consuming and you're taking out time and energy of the open source projects. And if you're not willing to step up, you're part of the problem, basically. We had the discussion keep going on, and then somebody, Doug is from the open source community, he said like, yeah, basically don't be a freeloader. And then the person said like, well, I didn't pay, but there's so much money in there, why should I do anything? Like, they have money, they should just do stuff. Which is always an interesting discussion. Once a company has money, like how do you allocate it? The problem was that nobody was really responsible full-time for the Ruby driver. It was somebody's side project. Like, for example, the PHP driver is also somebody's side project, and they basically spend half a day once a month or so on those pieces of software. The maintainer then had a lengthy answer of why it happened like this. This is more just to his defense and not show that he was not doing something, but why stuff were in a certain state they were in. But the conclusion for us was indeed then we did hire one more engineer, and we now have Emily who is taking care of that. And now you can look at the commit graphs and you can see there was not that much stuff happening anymore, but once she got aboard, you can see that last green spike. That is basically where she got involved and pushed the project further. And then for the Rails integration, we basically decided that we had the active record pattern, and we don't think it's kind of a good pattern for what we try to do, and we just switched over to the repository pattern, and that's what all the code deletes are. So basically, we switched out code that we think was basically unfixable, and that's the way forward, and we show people how to migrate to that. So that's kind of what we do there. The next problem or thing that happens every now and then is, how do you approach money and how do you prioritize with money? So the first question is normally like, do you even take venture capital? Yes or no? Like normally in the US, people are very venture capital friendly. In Europe, they're maybe a bit more conservative. Kind of the two trade-offs that you have there is accelerated development. If you take on money now, you might be able to hire lots more people and do that much faster development. So you will grow much faster and you might take over the market quicker before anybody else can enter or take your market share. On the downside is you will have this business influence from your venture capital afterwards, because they want to have a say in where you're going as a company, and they will push you to make profit afterwards. So it's kind of like a fine balance that you need to find. The next thing is development. How much do you push into the commercial space? Because some open source products ended up like, they have like an open source version, but it's basically unusable because they want you to use the commercial one. And the other thing is you have this great open source project, but basically the company is dying behind it. And that's also not helping anybody. The two examples that I have here are InfluxDB and RethinkDB. Who knows InfluxDB? It's kind of a metric store. It used to be very widely used, but they then decided anything that is going beyond the single server, so any replication or sharding of your data, will be commercial. And they basically took away any high availability or anything like that from the open source ecosystem, which limited their market to a much smaller segment and kind of hobbled their adoption. But it of course makes them more money because anybody who is using that in a more enterprisey environment will need to pay them. Though we internally always call it to pull an influx to kind of make your market much smaller. We have that phrase for that. The other thing is RethinkDB. Anybody tried or used RethinkDB? It was something, it's a document store that was very popular. It was like, people said like it's the better MongoDB. And it was especially about streaming and real-time data. It had a lot of good ideas. The problem was they never found the right balance between business and open source product. And in the end, they ran out of money. And I think it was the project was donated to the Linux Foundation in the end, but it has been pretty dead. I think they're doing a release now, but it has been basically a year where nothing happened, which is probably the end of the product. So you can be out there and not take money, or you can take money and then you might be pushed to kind of an area where you don't want to go. So those are two examples. The other big thing where I'm curious how taking on a lot of money will work out is this one. Where I'm also not sure, is anybody here paying Docker Inc? Nobody? Okay. Yeah, that's kind of the common thing. Like they took on a lot of money and everybody's using Docker, but basically nobody is paying Docker. And at some point they will probably run out of money or need another funding round. And then it's like, okay, what is the chance to ever get the money back we put into that? And I'm curious what will happen to that. But since they have now Moby, where kind of the technology lives, I think even if Docker Inc, the company, goes down, the container world would live on. Probably it's not much different than before anyway. But there it's again like, yeah, you had a company, but others are reaping the profits now. Everybody's talking about Kubernetes, kind of like Docker is the commodity and you're the baseline, but nobody's paying you for that. Then you have this discussion about releases. Do you have multiple releases, like you have an open source version and you have a commercial version? Or do you have like some plugins that you add? The downside with multiple products is normally what happens is you test a commercial version because that's what you're selling and that's what support needs to do, and then you take out some features or make the product a bit worse, and that's the open source version. And most companies don't have the resources to test that properly anymore. So oftentimes the open source version is a bit the testing field afterwards. Proprietary plugins have the downside that development is often much harder because, well, you do a commit that touches on open source and proprietary plugin, then you will always need to test the right pieces together, otherwise stuff might fail. Examples are DataStax, where they had this very ugly divorce between Apache Cassandra, DataStax Cassandra, and DataStax Cassandra is now just its own product, and I think you need to dump out the data to actually migrate between them. Qt is an example where you have commercial plugins into the open source version. And then you finally have this decision between open source and open code, or visible code, which some companies have. For example, Cockroach Labs, but also GitLab, I think, they have this, that you can even the stuff that you need to pay for, you can see the code in GitHub, but you need to pay for a commercial license to actually use it. Maybe some companies or people might work around that, especially in China, it seems to be a cultural difference. But the assumption is oftentimes that no company in Europe or in the US would circumvent a license because kind of the penalties would be so high and the loss in reputation would be so high that nobody would take the risk. And yes, you're okay with 1% or so of your users kind of circumventing the license, but it's probably much easier for you because you just have one repository and you can show the issues and people can figure out what is going on, and you don't have this boundary between open source and commercial parts. So, what have we done? So we always say this is the open source heart that we have, and everything is kind of like spinning around the open source heart, and I really like the animation. We generally have open core, like we have open source, we have free, which is basic, and then we have commercial plugins. Why do we have free but not open source plugins? Any guesses? Because of AWS. It's basically the thing that the default download that you will get if you download our software or use our software, both the Docker container or the RPM or Debian package or whatever, will include the free stuff. Because we think everybody should use that. And we also want to kind of implant that perception that this is kind of the full feature set. And that on AWS, you will not get the full feature set. And that is kind of like our competitive advantage then, that only if you run it yourself, you can get those features, or if you come to our own cloud. But if you run it on a competing cloud service, you will not get a lot of the features that we provide. And then we have commercial features that we will charge. They're either part in our cloud service, or you can pay for a license to run it on-premise. We recently also made this switch that all our code is open. It's not open source, but even our commercial features are on GitHub. So you can go to our GitHub repository and see what is going on, which is some customers told me that this is very nice because they had something, they were using something wrong or something, somewhere was a bug, and they could just look up now what is going on. How is this actually working? You don't have to write to support anymore, but you just look like, okay, what is actually happening behind the scenes? And then you can even file the issue on GitHub directly, and then you also see when is it fixed and what is the fix. And maybe you could even patch it together yourself, or you just wait for the next minor release. But also for us, communication is much easier, and it's much easier to have everything in one single repository and not have an open source repository and a private repository. So generally we see it pretty much like this. You have the open source space, and then you have the open features, which are split up in free and paid features. So that's generally the approach of how we see that. And I would estimate that the open source code is like 80%, 70, 90, I don't know, but it's kind of the vast majority of the code. And then we have another layer of open features, but not open source features. We obviously have training and consulting as well, but they are more strategic. You don't make a lot of money and they don't scale that well. We do provide Kibana and Elasticsearch as a service, and if you want to run it on-premise, we also have this where you can run it on-premise. And we also have a Swag store. But I'm not sure how much money we're making out of the Swag store, but it's probably 0.0 something percent. I would assume. I don't know. I haven't looked up the numbers. But if you want to get the socks, or, I mean, stickers I have, so you can just take the stickers here. Or if you want to have the umbrella, you can go to the Elastic shop, and, well, we're trying to make the money wherever we can. So, final point, success. What even is success? So the one thing that I think you need to keep in mind with open source is that the business side is kind of optional. And there are very successful open source projects that don't have a company behind them. Probably one of the better known ones is Postgres, where you have a lot of contributors from companies or universities that use it, have been using it for a long time. But there are also more recent examples. For example, Envoy, which is also kind of in a Kubernetes ecosystem for proxying, very popular. And Matt Klein, the author, who is working for Lyft, where this was initially developed, he lays out in his blog post why he did not want to start a company. And basically he says, like, because he didn't want to run a company that has a very high chance of failing, and him investing a lot of his time and energy into something, and then basically working for somebody's venture capital and being not their slave, but kind of like being very much in the obligation of doing what they want. And luckily Lyft and others are happy to sponsor this. So they have, like, you have big companies who are happy or willing to sponsor Envoy as an open source product. So they won't start the company out of that, but they still have the open source product there. The other thing that you need to say or keep in mind is that business is complicated with open source products, and it feels like everybody is experimenting and trying to find the right way or combination of things, but I'm not sure anybody has really found it. It's kind of a problem. And one thing, that is another tweet I really like, where somebody says, like, yes, a lot of closed source companies are doing open source now as well, and they get a lot of appreciation for that. But if you're kind of a commercial open source company, you get all the shit for having something closed source. And it's kind of like, if you're coming from the closed source world, people will applaud every minor thing that you open source. Whereas if you're an open source company, people will shit all over you for making anything not open source, which is kind of in the perception of stuff a bit different. So we have 5 minutes. Any questions or disagreement? Is anybody thinking about starting an open source company? Because I had people like that in the audience already. You're planning that, okay? You're always okay? What will be your business model?
no idea about the real answer. I was very interested in the talk. I mean, the idea is that you don't want to do a business in the beginning. You just want to grow slowly and create a trust relationship with your customers.
I guess you want to grow fast.
No.
No?
Not really.
Okay.
For me, the main reason is when you have a number of customers and a small price, maybe it's not worth for the others to do their own, to steal your software and install themselves. Obviously, the main problem is what you were mentioning about the cloud providers. This is a business that is really eating your job and giving nothing back to you. So I was really interested about this server-side license, or what's the name, the new one.
Yeah.
They are trying to. I'm very curious to see if there is a way where we all not can fix.
Maybe it's really time to redefine open source or find something in parallel to open source to make that. Because yes, it's probably deterring people from doing things in the open, because somebody could, once you're successful, somebody will just take your stuff and probably put you out of business. Or it's very hard to compete with AWS because they have everybody's credit card and it's just like one click away. It's so easy. It's very hard to get your own service out. So yes, I don't want to bash too much on AWS, but they're very good at that, unfortunately.
We all see that. And what about your open code but not open source solution? Is it really, could it really be a different, a solution that works?
We have it. Let me switch here. I mistyped Elastic. If you could type Elasticsearch, it would be so much easier. So you have, everything here is Apache license except for this folder. Oops, sorry, you cannot see that. I'm on the wrong screen. So this is the Elasticsearch repository. Everything here is Apache license except for this folder. And every file in there has our own license. So everything is open, and well, we assume that some people will just comment out the license checks, but we don't assume it will eat very much into our revenue, because no Western company will do that probably. Nobody would run the risk.
Neither Amazon.
Yeah, and neither Amazon or any of the big cloud providers. They probably also wouldn't want to do that, because that would open you to huge legal problems. It just makes builds and anything around issues and like commenting much easier, but it is of course some risk, and you need to be very careful that we had it that we wanted to change the license on something, but once you push it under the Apache license, you cannot just take it and change the license on it anymore. So you need to be very careful. Sometimes you have a pull request, which is a cool new feature, and then you push it to the wrong folder or with the wrong license header, and there is no going back anymore.
Yeah, but it's less risky than just doing everything open source.
Yes, I mean, you want to have some protection in the open source system. But it is not an open source license. We have like this open code or visible code, and we also got a lot of bad feedback or not a lot, but sometimes people, like the hardcore open source people, they say like, oh, people see open and they autocomplete to open source. And we're always like, we say open code to make it clear, but people see open and they assume open source, and you're tricking people. And there's this term of whitewashing or open washing your software, that people pretend to be open source, but they really are not, which we are not really trying to do, because we don't add this commons clause at the end or anything. It's really, we try to keep the separation. But it is an issue that comes up every now and then, yeah.
Anyhow, Elastic is currently using this model.
Yes, that's our model. I think there was a question back.
Yeah, how would I know that it's open code and not open source?
I'm pretty sure we have some license note here. I'm not sure, it's somewhere, or it's probably in the license file. Let me check. We probably have a license text here. So this one here is open source. This is the Apache license, and then if you head over to that folder, if I would see it, and there you have the special license notice. And it will also be in every single source code file that you touch in there. So if you add, I don't know, We might need to head down a few folders to get to an actual Java file. But this then has the right header, whereas all our other files have an Apache header. So for us, it's in every single file. And we will make sure that's that way. I think we even have like pre-commit hooks, or we have some automated checks to make sure that everything is licensed the way we intended to. Cool. I think my time is up. Thanks a lot.